Have you ever wondered whether the modern real estate hustle is really modern at all? Because 2,000 years ago, in the city of Rome, one man was already doing something that feels strangely familiar. He bought distressed property. He used private labor to renovate it. He took advantage of disasters. He built a fortune from urban chaos. And he became so rich that even by Roman standards he stood out. This is the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the Roman billionaire who may not have invented real estate speculation, but absolutely perfected one of its oldest and darkest forms. When people think about ancient Rome, they usually picture emperors, gladiators, legions, and marble temples. They think of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, of senators in white togas, of giant arenas full of blood and spectacle. What they don't usually picture is the property market. But Rome was not just a military empire, it was also a city. A crowded, dangerous, unequal, overheated city, packed with people, apartments, workshops, alleyways, and constant risk. And in that environment, property was power. To understand Crassus, you have to understand Rome itself. By the 1st century BC, Rome was one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean world. Hundreds of thousands of people were packed into a city not really designed for that scale. The rich lived in spacious houses called domus. The poor lived in insulae, apartment blocks that could be cramped, badly built, unstable, and vulnerable to fire. And fire was a constant threat. This was a city of wooden beams, oil lamps, crowded kitchens, workshops with open flames, and narrow streets that made emergency response difficult. A blaze in one building could quickly spread to the next. Entire neighborhoods could go up in smoke. Now imagine what a ruthless businessman sees when he looks at that city. Not danger, opportunity. That was Crassus. Marcus Licinius. Crassus was born into a wealthy Roman family, but his real rise came during one of the bloodiest periods in Roman history. Rome, in the 1st century BC, was not a stable republic calmly governed by wise statesmen. It was a political machine soaked in ambition, violence, and civil conflict. One of the major turning points in Crassus's early life was the dictatorship of Lucius Cornelius Sulla. When Sulla seized power, he carried out proscriptions, essentially official kill lists. Political enemies were murdered, their property was confiscated, and their wealth was sold off. This was terror, but it was also liquidation, and Crassus knew exactly how to profit from it. He bought confiscated property cheaply, very cheaply. Land, houses, estates, all sold off under violent conditions. It was one of the ugliest wealth transfers in Roman history, and Crassus was one of the men who knew how to turn the political bloodshed into private fortune. That matters because it tells you something important about him. Crassus was not just rich. He was opportunistic at a level that made even other Romans uneasy. And once he understood how much money could be made from distressed assets, he kept going. This is where the most famous story about Crassus begins. Ancient sources describe how he built a private fire brigade. At first, that sounds noble, even useful. Rome needed fire response. Public services were weak and often improvised. A wealthy man who organized trained workers to fight fires might sound like a benefactor. But Crassus was not creating a charity. According to the traditional story, when a building caught fire, Crassus and his men would rush to the scene. But they would not immediately put the fire out. First, Crassus would approach the owner and offer to buy the burning property at a tiny fraction of its value. Imagine your building is on fire. Smoke is everywhere. Neighbors are screaming. The flames may spread at any moment. And standing in front of you is the richest operator in Rome, offering you a brutal choice. Sell now, cheaply, or watch everything burn. That is not firefighting. That is extortion with buckets. If the owner agreed, Crassus bought the property, and then his brigade would move in to extinguish the fire, salvage what they could, and add the building to his ever-growing real estate empire. If the owner refused, the story goes, the building might simply be left to its fate. Now, historians debate the precise details. Ancient writers loved dramatic anecdotes, and Roman elites often used moral storytelling to make a point. But whether every detail is literally true or not, the broader pattern is believable and consistent with what we know about Crassus. He specialized in acquiring damaged, distressed, or undervalued property. He had large numbers of enslaved workers. He used private organization and capital where the public system was weak, and he turned urban crisis into personal wealth. That is why he feels so modern. Crassus understood something that generations of real estate speculators, private equity firms, and distressed asset investors would later understand too. If you can buy low when everyone else is desperate, and if you have the labor and capital to rebuild, crisis becomes a business model. Rome gave him the perfect environment for that strategy. The city was constantly changing. Buildings collapsed. Fires spread. Political fortunes rose and fell. People ran out of money. Families lost property. Demand for housing remained high. And because Rome was the center of a vast republic, everyone wanted access to it. Crassus didn't just buy elite mansions. He invested in income-producing urban property, apartment buildings, rental units, structures that could be repaired, subdivided, improved, and monetized. He also had something many others did not: scale. Ancient sources say Crassus owned a huge number of enslaved people, including highly skilled ones. This is one of the darkest but most important parts of the story. His wealth was not built by clever negotiation alone. It rested on coerced labor. Crassus reportedly trained enslaved workers in valuable trades: construction, architecture, management, education, and domestic service. That meant he could buy a property in bad condition and use his own labor force to restore, expand, or repurpose it at relatively low cost. He did not have to rely on an open labor market in the way a modern landlord or developer might. He controlled the workforce directly. That gave him an enormous advantage. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you own a distressed building in a dangerous city, and you also own the builders, repair crews, and managers needed to fix it, your profit potential becomes huge. Crassus was not just flipping houses. He was vertically integrating disaster. And once you see that, the nickname Roman Billionaire starts to make sense. Ancient authors struggled to describe just how rich he was. Roman wealth was measured differently than modern wealth, of course, but Crassus was widely considered one of the richest men in Roman history. He had land, houses, silver mines, investments, slaves, political connections, and enormous liquidity. At one point, he is said to have claimed that no man was truly rich unless he could raise and support an army from his own resources. That is not normal rich. That is system-level rich. And like many people with system-level wealth, Crassus eventually wanted more than money. He wanted status. This is another reason his story feels so current. In many societies, there comes a point where wealth alone is not enough. The billionaire wants prestige, influence, legitimacy, the right to shape the state itself. That was Crassus. In Rome, money mattered, but aristocratic culture still treated military glory and political power as the highest prizes. A man could be rich and still feel overshadowed by a more glamorous rival. And Crassus had two such rivals, Pompey and Caesar. Pompey had military victories and popular fame. Caesar had charisma, ambition, and eventually legendary success. Crassus had money, a lot of money. But money alone did not automatically buy admiration. So Crassus entered high politics. He became part of the informal alliance we now call the First Triumvirate, alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. It was not an official constitutional body. It was essentially a power-sharing arrangement between three enormously influential men, each bringing something different. Caesar brought political skill and future military promise. Pompey brought military prestige and popularity. Crassus brought cash, and that cash mattered. Roman politics was expensive. Elections cost money. Clients had to be supported. Allies had to be cultivated. Public life ran on relationships, and relationships often ran on debt. Crassus was very good at making sure powerful people owed him something. That included Julius Caesar. At key moments in Caesar's career, Crassus is believed to have helped with financial backing. In a political world where debt could destroy a career, that gave him serious leverage. He was not just a landlord. He was a financier of Roman power. But even then, Crassus had a problem. He was rich enough to matter, but not admired enough to feel secure. He needed a stage on which he could prove he was more than a property shark in a toga. One opportunity came during the slave revolt led by Spartacus. In 73 BC, Spartacus and other escaped gladiators sparked one of the most famous uprisings in Roman history. As the rebellion grew, it humiliated Roman armies and frightened the elite. This was not just a military problem, it was a social nightmare. Rome was built on slavery, and here was a slave army defeating Roman forces. Crassus was given command. To his credit, he handled the campaign with discipline and severity. He imposed brutal punishments on his own troops when they failed, restored order, and eventually crushed the revolt. But even here, the glory was complicated. Pompey returned from Spain at the right moment and claimed part of the credit. So, even when Crassus won, someone else managed to shine. That pattern haunted him. He had the money, but he wanted the legend. And this is where his story turns from the real estate hustle to something larger and sadder. Crassus eventually sought military glory in the East, against Parthia. This decision is one of the great examples of how success in one domain can produce catastrophe in another. Being brilliant at acquiring property does not make you a great general. Being rich enough to finance influence does not make you strategically wise. But Crassus wanted the kind of victory that would put him on equal footing with Caesar and Pompey. So he pursued war. The campaign ended in disaster. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, Crassus and his forces were defeated by the Parthians. Roman heavy infantry struggled against a more mobile enemy. The campaign was badly conceived, and the outcome was devastating. Crassus himself was killed. Ancient writers who loved poetic justice later told the famous story that molten gold was poured into his mouth after death, as if to say, "Here is the wealth you loved so much." Whether literally true or not, the story stuck because it felt appropriate. Crassus became the Roman example of greed, ambition, and overreach. But the reason we still talk about him is not just that he was greedy. It is that he recognized something fundamental about cities and wealth. He understood that urban disorder could be monetized. He saw that when public services are weak, private power can step in and charge a premium. He understood that property in a major city is not just about owning space. It is about owning leverage. And that insight is incredibly modern. Even now, the most lucrative real estate fortunes are often built not in calm, stable conditions, but in moments of distress and imbalance. Someone else's foreclosure becomes your opportunity. Someone else's fire sale becomes your acquisition. Someone else's lack of options becomes your negotiating advantage. Crassus operated in a brutal, openly unequal slave society, so the comparison should not be pushed too far. But the structure of the logic is familiar. Find the distressed asset. Buy at the moment of maximum desperation. Use your capital and labor to restore or reposition the property. Convert crisis into rent. That is the hustle. And Rome gave him the perfect laboratory for it. This is also why the title of this episode matters. Did Crassus literally invent real estate investing? No. People had owned and traded property for as long as cities existed. He did not invent landlords, speculation, or construction. What he did do was turn all of those things into a highly organized strategy of accumulation. He industrialized opportunism. He made the city's weaknesses work for him. And he showed what happens when one person has enough money, labor, and influence to behave like a private emergency service, a landlord empire, and a financial institution at the same time. That combination is powerful. It is also dangerous, because once basic needs are tied to private opportunism, the line between entrepreneurship and predation gets very thin. Was Crassus a genius? In some ways, absolutely. He read the city correctly. He saw value where others saw danger. He understood the relationship between infrastructure failure and profit. He built scale. He diversified. He leveraged political instability. All of that is financially impressive. But was he admirable? That is much harder to say. Ancient Rome was full of men who enriched themselves through violence, exploitation, conquest, and slavery. Crassus was not unusual in that broad sense. What makes him memorable is how clearly he turned the city itself into a machine for extraction. He did not just profit from empire, he profited from emergency, and that is why he still feels relevant. Because every age produces its own Crassus figures. People who do very well when housing becomes unaffordable. People who acquire assets when others are forced to sell. People who call it efficiency when they are really feeding on imbalance. The technology changes, the laws change, the moral language changes, but the core pattern survives. And maybe that is the real lesson of Crassus. The real estate hustle is never just about buildings. It is about power over time, place, and desperation. In Rome, that power wore a toga. It arrived with a private fire brigade. It bought burning buildings for pennies. It rebuilt them with enslaved labor. And it turned one man into a fortune so large that, centuries later, we still use him as a symbol of wealth without limits. So, when you hear the phrase, "the Roman billionaire who invented the real estate hustle," that is what it really means. Not that Crassus created property markets, but that he understood, earlier and more ruthlessly than most, how a city in crisis could become a ladder to immense wealth. And like a lot of men who master the hustle, he eventually discovered that there is one thing money can't reliably buy: a glorious ending.